both in academic and in policy circles, we're now seeing a sea change in the understanding of where important policy work is going to be done in the next decade or two. Historically, most academics, most politicians in the United States have always focused on the federal level and felt that where you needed to make social change is in terms of national law. And what we're seeing now is a huge surge of interest in cities and sort of what can be done in the cities. And there are really two factors behind this. One is that there's a recognition that in the United States, but really across the world, it's cities that are the important geographical locations in which economic activity gets organized, and that there are vast differences now between cities that are very successful and cities that aren't. So interesting comparison would be Boston to Detroit. Boston in 1980 was supposedly going to do much, much worse than Detroit. Boston was supposed to be a city that was going to totally fail, be a basket case. Detroit, because of the car industry, was going to be, the best place to work in the United States. And of course, now in 2014, we look and we see just the opposite. Given where it started from, Boston is arguably the most successful city in the United States over the last 30 years in terms of economics. And Detroit is probably the least successful. It's not a matter of national policy, but it's a matter of sort of how cities and cities work that's really going to be critical. Now, second, of course, is that in the United States, approximately 90% of the people live in metropolitan areas. So if we're talking about sort of, where do people live, in a broad sense, they live in cities. So if you want to make important policies, it's got to be urban policy. And then third, is at this point in the United States, because of the conflict between Republicans and Democrats, it's basically impossible to get federal legislation passed. We're really at a period now where national politics are more polarized than they've been in decades, and means essentially it's almost impossible to have any effective policy. The good news is about most cities in the United States are not particularly divided by Republicans versus Democrats. The people who get elected as mayors and city councils and stuff usually are getting elected because they're known or hope to be good managers, practical people who want to solve the problems. So we've entered a new era where suddenly there's a focus on cities. Suddenly there's an interest in sort of how do we do urban policy decisions. And then I would say the third thing that's happened is, say third and fourth, is cities have decided, one, they need to be transparent in how they make their decisions, that things like data need to be publicly available, and two, that when they do make policy decisions, these decisions should be informed by empirical scientific research. So in this context, suddenly the big question gets raised, what could cities and universities do together? Now, of course, cities and universities, for the most part, historically, universities are ivory towers. We're supposed to sit up in our offices and have deep inner thoughts and not worry at all about what's going on in the outside. But this is now fundamentally changing. And so at Boston, I'm co-director of something called the Boston Area Research Initiative. This is an inter-university effort involving 7 universities, 7 different schools at Harvard. But there are other cities like London, Chicago, New York, where there are similar types of efforts being launched to bring first-rate, high-quality research to local policy decision-making. So let me give you a couple of examples. In some sense, they're very simple, but they show sort of the potential synergy between universities and city governments. Now, city governments in the United States these days, particularly the bigger cities, have enormous amounts of data. In general, however, the people who work in city governments don't know a lot about how to analyze data. So they have initially an enormous amount of information, but little idea of what to do with it. University researchers just love data, and anybody who has lots of it is somebody they would like to know. And so what we have is a situation in which there's potential for researchers and people in city governments to work together to figure out how data can be analyzed to address particular policy problems. And I want to give you two examples. One that's really quite simple, done by a researcher that the Boston Area Research Initiative supported, a graduate student, and another one we're just launching. So in the United States in the last 4 or 5 years, one of the big things is we all should start riding bicycles. Bicycles are the new big idea. And in fact, in Boston, we have bicycles that you could rent for the day or for an hour. But of course, the streets, particularly in an old city like Boston, remember it's founded in 1630, the streets are not made for bicycles. And so bicycle accidents, even bicycle fatalities, are relatively common. Drivers don't know much about how to deal with bicycles, and bicyclists seem to not know much about road rules, and this is not a very happy situation. So we supported a graduate student over in the School of Public Health to take the data from the city on all the bicycle accidents that they had. These data was collected through hospitals. What would happen is somebody would have a severe accident, they'd be taken to a hospital, and that would go into a dental basic database, and look to see where the accidents were. Now, in some senses, this is found very straightforward, but you have a very large database. You may not know even sort of how to extract any information out of that, much less do you have a way of putting it quickly into some form of map. But that's what the student did, and she found several very interesting things. One was just 8-10 different spots in the whole city of Boston where a large percentage of the issues, the accidents, were occurring. Second was that there were 2 primary spots. One was along a road near the Boston University where a lot of students and cars travel. And, there was just sort of accident after accident as you went down this road. Second was literally there was a place where in one street there was a particularly large gap in the roadway between its height at one side versus the other. And dozens of people had hit this gap, taken very bad falls that were sufficiently bad to end them up in the hospital. So, you start with this kind of general observation that, isn't it great everybody's riding bicycle? Isn't it terrible that we're having all these accidents? And you suddenly, by getting help from university researchers, discover, well, you've got 2 problems. One's a particular corridor where you might maybe say you need to put up cement structures so that you actually separate bicycle riders from the cars themselves. And the second is you've got this spot on the street where there's a several inch difference in height, and yes, you better get the road crew to go fix that. So that's a nice example of something that's enormously practical, simple, but university researchers were able to be helpful. Second example that we're just getting started on is looking at what's called the Problem Housing Project. So the belief in Boston is that often neighborhoods get themselves in trouble when there's a particular house that's neglected, that's taken over by drug dealers, where there's maybe a lot of violence, frequent police calls. And again, like the bicycle thing, the city, in this case particularly the police department, but the housing department, other departments as well, have lots and lots of data. And the question is, how can we use that data for two things? One, actually to develop some models to predict where problem housing is likely to occur in the future. And second, to identify where there are houses now that are causing lots of problems. So this is an example where, the second part, looking at defining these houses, is not that hard, but you still have to know how to deal with the data. So researchers can be helpful there. But in a more sophisticated way, one needs to build models that allows one to predict based on characteristics of neighborhoods, characteristics of the houses, who they're owned by, what vacancy rates are in that neighborhood and stuff, that allow you to intervene hopefully even beforehand so that you can keep a problem from happening before it occurs. So what do these two examples illustrate? I think they illustrate two basic principles. One is a very simple one, which is, yes, cities have lots and lots of data about all kinds of things, whether it's students who are succeeding or failing in school, or particular areas where there's lots of crime, or, as I mentioned, the housing problems or bicycle accidents. Clearly, academics can be helpful at helping cities identify where those problems go. That's fairly straightforward. I think in many ways the much more exciting thing is the idea of developing predictive models for social problems. So let me give you another just very quick example is, the housing authorities have gotten interested in how do you avoid evictions. Evictions are very expensive for housing authorities. Well, can we figure out from various rental behavior, payment behavior, income behavior, what families look like they're going to be in trouble in 6 months, a year, or 2 years? So I think the long run goal is not going to be just to address the problems that exist, but maybe even more importantly, to try to minimize, stop problems from developing that would have occurred without any kind of intervention, and where the research is really going to help, and I think be critical, is showing where it is and when it is that the interventions need to occur.